The origins of the American Revolution. Is this a big deal in terms of how I'm teaching this class? Absolutely. You need to know the causes, the origins of the war, especially a war like the American Revolution, since that's the reason the American Revolution is why we don't speak English in this country. Come on, I can't get any funnier than that. Thank you. Just a little bit of a snicker would be good. The 7 Years' War, a little review. The British victory in the 7 Years' War was the good news. The British and the colonists won. The French and most of the Indians lost. That's the way it was supposed to go. The bad news was that after the war, Great Britain decided, that was an expensive war. It was a world war. And now they decided that the colonists, their allies, should help pay for the war. That means what? How does the government pay for anything? Taxes. Right. So new taxes. This is the story of the origin of the American Revolution. New taxes. So the British government, without seeking the consent, that is the approval of the governed, that is the colonists, began a number of new taxes to help them pay the war debt, which again was enormous. The essential point here is that Great Britain had never before taxed the colonists and then sent the money back home to England to be spent as they saw fit. Okay, that had never happened before. Before this point, at the end of the 7 Years' War, the colonists themselves in their own legislatures, the Virginia legislature and the Massachusetts legislature, had passed taxes on themselves, and they had spent the money on their own roads or whatever, okay, bridges and such. That's colonial taxation. But the mother country, Great Britain, had never taxed them and taken the money out of the colonies. So there's a huge difference here because the colonists voted themselves these taxes, but now the British government is not going to ask them. They're just going to pass the taxes in Parliament back in London and then send the tax agents over to gather the taxes in various forums in the colonies. This is a huge difference. The American Revolution was not about taxes in the sense that we just don't like to pay taxes. How many Americans like to pay taxes? Thank you. It's unanimous. We don't. Do we have representation today? That is, have we voted on, if we're eligible to vote, have we voted on representatives to decide whether we're going to raise or lower taxes? Have we done that? Yeah, every 2, 4, and then 6 years. We do. Okay. So we have representation. Our Congress people, our senators, etc. At this point, though, with Great Britain passing new taxes, we have no representation, no way to say no, no way to vote on that. That's what this is about. In other words, it's not democratic, is it? No. But there's no concept of democracy at this time that applies to all people, applies to all, even white people. No one has a government like that. That is why the American Revolution is so special. That's what makes it different. And to forget that is to forget the whole context of 200 years ago and what the fight was about. So now Great Britain itself proposes to tax the colonists and take the money out of the colonies. Again, without asking the colonists' permission. This is what is called taxation without representation. And the colonists said, no taxation without representation. In other words, unless we get to vote on it, our representatives. If I ask you for the resounding slogan of the Revolutionary War, that is it. No taxation without representation. It is not just no taxation. Okay? Among these taxes and new laws, and now it's going to take a dozen years of this British behavior to get the colonists to say, enough. It doesn't happen overnight. Look how patient the founding fathers were here. 12 years. Amongst these new laws, the Sugar Act of 1764, the year after the 7 Years' War ended, here come the British. The Sugar Act of 1764 is simply a tariff on sugar. So the sugar comes in from the West Indies, it's there at the port in Boston or the other ports, and there's a customs agent, a tax agent there, placing a duty, a tariff on the incoming sugar. You're the importer now, you've got to raise the price of your sugar to the colonists to pay the tariff on it. That's what a tariff is. It's great in this time, in this age, because it's easy to do. All you got to have is somebody standing there at the port. That's a ton of sugar. That's $2. You add that to the cost of the sugar coming in. The importer then raises the price of the sugar. Who ends up paying the tax? Exactly. Anybody who buys sugar pays a little bit more because of that tariff. That's the way a tariff worked then. That's the way a tariff works now. Okay? You have to understand tariffs because they still matter. The next election is going to be about the tariffs on Chinese trade. If you don't understand that, you can't make an intelligent choice. At least in part about that. Then there was the Stamp Act of 1765. Everybody knows what a stamp is. The Stamp Act said that in order to print anything, a newspaper, a contract, any piece of paper has to have a stamp on it. You got to go to the stamp office to buy the stamp. When you buy that stamp, where does that money go then from the stamp office? It goes back to Great Britain, okay? It's a royal stamp office, the king's stamp office. So that's how that works. And then if you're passing out some kind of literature or a newspaper that doesn't have a stamp on it, it's illegal. Easy to trace that newspaper back to the source, right? You're arrested or forced to pay a fine. That is the Stamp Act. But so angry were the colonists over the Stamp Act that they started boycotting British goods. They're not going to buy these imported goods and so forth. That's going to hurt the tariff, you see. And so the Stamp Act is repealed in 1766. And as the author of your text says, it wasn't raising any revenue anyway. People were just ignoring it. And if you don't have enough troops there to enforce it, well then, it's a problem. Then the British government passed the Quartering Act of 1765. The Quartering Act, you all know what quarters are, where you keep the soldiers in their quarters, right? The Quartering Act of 1765 said that the colonists had to pay for quartering British soldiers. More British soldiers are going to be coming because of all the trouble. Great Britain doesn't want to pay to house these soldiers. We'll pass a law that says you colonists have to pay for the British soldiers in your midst. Now imagine you're a colonist. And the young British soldier knocks on your door and says, I've been assigned to your house. And there you stand with your wife and your 16-year-old daughter and your 12-year-old son. You have no idea who this person is. You have no choice. But that person now lives in your house. A Quartering Act. You think that's going to cause some problems? Yeah. Great Britain doesn't care. The problems continue. The Townshend Acts of 1767. Things are not going well. The colonists are causing all kinds of trouble. And so the Townshend Acts of 1767 suspend New York's colonial legislature. The colony of New York has its own little Congress. And they had not been complying with the Quartering Act. And so now in the Townshend Acts, that New York colonial legislature is not allowed to meet at all. And then it also raises new tariffs, okay, on more products. Now, it is repealed. You see the progress of this here. You pass a law. It's not well received. There's all kinds of demonstrations against the law. And then the British government decides, oh, it's too much trouble and it's not working. And so they repeal it. What have they just taught the colonists to do? Exactly. Now I'm going to give you a little parental lesson that is worth your entire tuition for this class, and probably for the entire semester. A parental lesson from history. We've all seen it. We're in Safeway or Fred Meyer's, maybe Walmart. I don't want to pick on any particular grocer. And we're standing in line, getting ready to go out and, pay for our whatever. And there's a mom with one 2-year-old on her hip, and then a 4-year-old in the basket. And then the 6-year-old is, tagging along and kind of holding on. And the 6-year-old decides that now is the time to hit mom up for some M&Ms right there on the checkout line. It's always worked before, right? And mom says no. And then what does the 6-year-old do? Wah! Oh, isn't that grating? Oh, I hate that. And throws a hissy fit. Now, mom is embarrassed. And she's got the one in the cart, she's got the one on the hip, and she's looking around, and all the people are going, ah! And so she does what the British government did. She turns her no into a yes. Doesn't she? I don't know, 9 times out of 10. Yeah, I've watched. When she just teach all those 3 kids to do, throw a hissy fit when they want something because she changed her mind. She'd have been so much better off before the kid threw a hissy fit to say, okay, you can have the candy bar. No hissy fit, no bad lesson. But if she says no, that's a no, folks. And you don't change your mind because you don't want to teach them to throw a hissy fit. Now, someday you're going to remember this. And you're going to think back, I can't remember that professor's name, but he was so right. And some of you remember throwing the hissy fit, don't you? Yeah. So, learn from history. Learn from the past. This is human nature, folks. If you throw a hissy fit and you get your way, guess what? You're going to do it again. So, the Tea Act comes along after a period of relative stability. Some people actually thought the problem had gone away, but the British government passed the Tea Act of 1773. And this is really complicated, so I'm not going to ask you on the test the inside workings of the Tea Act. But basically what it does is the price of tea goes down. You'd think that'd be a good thing. Okay, so they're not going to complain, these colonists, because the price of tea went up. It went down. Good. But what it did was declare that the only legal importer of tea was Great Britain. And a lot of the colonists made their living importing tea. In fact, importing is a polite way of saying smuggling. Okay? So what the Tea Act threatens to do is to put a lot of colonists out of business. So now what happens as a result of the Tea Act? We all know that the Native Americans got into the act, and they raided the British tea ships and threw the tea over into Boston Harbor, didn't they? No. Native Americans don't drink tea, and they couldn't care less. What happened? Why did I bring the Native Americans into the story? You've been probably hearing this since 3rd grade. Some of the colonists, the rabble-rousers, dressed up like Indians. About 16 of them. And they got on board those British ships and they dumped the tea over. This is the Boston Tea Party. And from this day, Boston Harbor has been polluted. Environmental disaster. Well, maybe that's coming later. I don't know. It's not such a big deal, financially, but it demonstrates on the part of the colonists an unwillingness to be governed by Great Britain. The Boston Tea Party of 1773. The news of the Tea Party now goes back to King George in England, and the king is incensed. It causes him to use the Old Testament language to harden his heart. What happens when Pharaoh hardens his heart in the story of the Exodus? Well, the idea was it wasn't going to be good for the people of Israel, but as it happened, God sent judgments on Egypt. Right? It kind of works that way. The king hardens his heart towards the colonists. He's getting angry. Now Britain imposed what Great Britain itself called the coercive acts. This is an absolute slap. We are calling this law the coercive acts. We will coerce you to behavior as loyal British subjects. It's rare when politicians call something really what it is. They do. They wanted to send a message. Usually, no matter what the legislation is, they call it along the lines of, this is to make everybody happy act. But it seldom does. In the colonies, the coercive acts got a different name. They're called the intolerable acts. As if history is not confusing enough, you have to have two names for the same law. And the intolerable acts, the coercive acts, closed Boston Harbor. You dump my tea overboard, your harbor is closed. No more ships coming in and out, no more trade. Starve Boston. Occupied Boston with British troops, the redcoats, the regulars. And they virtually now are denying self-government to Massachusetts. 150 years of tradition and practice coming to a close. In the transpiring of these events since 1764, these 10 years, I'm reminded of Shakespeare's words. One woe, a woe is a hardship. One woe doth tread upon another's heel. You know, when you've been walking and somebody kicks the back of your shoe because they're walking too close. Really close together. One woe doth tread upon another's heel, so quick they follow. These laws, one after another. How long will we put up with this treatment? In September 1774, the First Continental Congress meets. The colonial legislatures agreed that they should all meet together in Philadelphia to discuss these problems. The first time Continental Congress. They respond to the intolerable acts. It's 1774, the revolution is still 2 years away. The Declaration of Independence is still 2 years away. Note the patience, the poise of most of the founding fathers. Some people are saying, of course, how come you people don't respond? How come you don't move more quickly? The Congress condemned the British interference in the colonies and these new taxes. And after the Congress adjourned, the men went home. They reported back to their respective legislatures in the colonies. The Virginia Assembly met to discuss what to do next. Many of the Virginians thought that the trouble up north in Boston was not their concern, not their problem. Perhaps it was just the hotheads of Boston and Massachusetts that brought this trouble on themselves. And then Patrick Henry, who was himself one of these legislators in Virginia. Now, I don't want you to be confused. This is not the First Continental Congress. This is back in Virginia in the House of Burgesses, their local Virginia Assembly. And Patrick Henry had had enough of their squabbling and their arguing. And Henry at this time, and for many years later, was known as perhaps the finest speaker, the finest orator in the colonies. If anybody knew that Henry was going to give a speech, they all came to listen to the man. And so Henry rises in the assembly hall, and he walks out in front of his chair, and he begins to speak. Why stand we here idle? Why are we doing nothing? Our brethren are already in the field. Our brothers up north are already marching in the fields. What do the gentlemen wish? These are all the aristocracy of Virginia, the gentlemen, right? The men of property. Frankly, the men of what? Virginia? Slaves. What do the gentlemen wish? Is life so dear? Is peace so sweet as to be purchased at the price of chains and slavery? Now, who's he talking to? Slave owners. Are you going to be slaves? And then he finishes. I know not what course others may take. But as for me, give me liberty or give me death. And he did have a dagger in his hand. And there was a young man sitting in an open window. And he was so moved by what Henry said. He said, hooray for Henry! And he fell out the window. He was okay. Now, the Virginia colonial legislature votes to send representatives up north again in the next year to the Second Continental Congress. They are not going to stand there idle. But even before the delegates to the Second Continental Congress convened that spring of 1775, fighting erupted just outside the city of Boston. But there is no consensus, there's no unanimity regarding independence yet in 1775. Again, it doesn't come until a year later. But the British, now knowing that the colonials have stashed arms near Concord, Massachusetts, and that the colonials have been organizing their militia and so forth, in possible rebellion, decide to send a large force, several hundred redcoats, out of Boston in the dead of night and cross over to the mainland and then march up the Lexington Concord Road. This is what you've been reading about in April morning. This is April 19th, 1775. The colonists have spies. They know that it's likely that either tonight, tomorrow night, some night, the British are going to do exactly this. They want to capture Samuel Adams. They want to capture John Hancock. They want to find the barns where the rifles are kept and the powder and shot. Take away their guns. They can't defend themselves. And so Paul Revere and others are organized to spread the alarm throughout the countryside if the British march out of Boston. And that's what they do. Revere rides, and then he tells a group at a crossroads, and then that group mushrooms in every direction and again, and so that the sound of the alarm goes across every farm in the region. Now, it's going to take hours to respond for those farthest away, but they're going to. And the alarm is sounded at Lexington. And the men got up in the middle of the night before dawn. And as you know, in reading the novel, they're discussing what they're going to do. And the British regulars came off the road at Lexington and they marched on to the green. They could have just stayed on the road and marched right by. And those militiamen, they wouldn't have known what to do. But they were there to teach a lesson. And the British officer's not going to do that. He's not going to march right by. He's going to disperse that mob, you see. Nobody knows who fired the first shot, the so-called shot heard around the world. Could have been a British soldier, could have been a colonist. But when that shot went off, the British then fired a volley right into the crowd. 8 men died, others wounded. Everybody runs away, including 16-year-old Adam Cooper. What happens the rest of the day? That's what the book is about. The British then, back on the road, they march on to Concord. They're still trying to find the weapons in the barn, and Hancock and Adams and so forth. But by the time they got to Concord, they're not facing just a few dozen men. They're facing hundreds of colonists now who have staked out a defensive position. And the British now are turned back. And now they've got to march all the way back. Down the road they came, all the way past Lexington, and all the way back to Boston. Meanwhile, hours have taken place, and the colonists from all over New England have responded to the call by Paul Revere and his men, and they are swarming on that road. Battle Road. Surviving British soldiers wrote letters home about this experience of marching back to Boston. It was hell. It was a nightmare. One man in particular stood out in their nightmares, the man on the white horse. A man on a white horse who would get off that horse and hide himself and take a shot at those British soldiers, and they're in their beautiful red coats, and they're marching down the road in splendid array with a white belt crisscrossed on their hearts. A target. And he knows how to use his rifle, as most of these men did, hunting and such. And this man on a white horse would take a shot, and he would get back on his horse, and he would ride another half a mile or a mile down, find another good spot, and shoot again. And again. And again. Death rode a white horse. Revelation 6, verses 7 and 8. Though blood had now been shed, the fighting had started, still there's no consensus towards independence in the Continental Congress. But King George now refuses to compromise. Indeed, it became known that the king was contemplating ending religious freedom in the colonies because he believed that religious freedom had led to the desire for political freedom. And we know that those pilgrims back in 1620 had always claimed that they had religious freedom and they wanted political freedom. You see, that idea had been growing ever since. And then the Enlightenment, of course, had contributed to that ideology. John Locke, etc. So the king was afraid that this religious freedom was feeding the idea of political freedom, and you know what? He was right. He was absolutely right. The two would not separate. Now, he's not right, in my opinion, in the conclusion that he draws. But he was right in terms of the causes of this anger towards the British. Religious freedom had led to the desire for political freedom, and it was reinforced by Enlightenment philosophy. And British taxes, in which the colonists were not treated as people worthy of a vote, of a say in their own government, was just an example that was the last straw, if you will, or the spark that ignited the whole thing. the rumor that King George was going to end religious freedom, we're all going to have to be what if the king has his way? That's right. We're all going to have to be Anglicans. No more Baptists or Methodists or Presbyterians or Congregationalists. Certainly no more Quakers, those obstreperous people. Right? All have to be Anglicans. Then in early 1776, the dead of winter, a radical by the name of Thomas Paine published a pamphlet called Common Sense. This may be the most important pamphlet in American history. Paine's pamphlet was reproduced and printed hundreds of thousands of copies, etc. And the pamphlet persuaded many Americans who were sitting on the fence, so to speak, that the only solution to their troubles was independence from Great Britain. Paine was not really a religious man himself, but he knew the American people, and so he used biblical language to explain to them why the only course was separation from Great Britain, independence from Great Britain, common sense. Following Paine's advice, Congress then, meeting in the summer of 1776 on July 4th, declared independence. I don't know what the percentage is of Americans who can't tell the difference between the Declaration of Independence and the Constitution of the United States, but I guarantee you nobody in this class will be unable to do that. That is a travesty. It's not a trick question. What does the Declaration of Independence do? It's not a government document. It does not create a government. It's not a constitution. It's not a Bill of Rights. It declares independence from Great Britain. That's why we call it what we call it, the Declaration of Independence. In other words, it's the get the hell out and leave us alone declaration. Now do we all have it? Yeah. But Thomas Jefferson is the author now. And he believes that he ought to explain to the world why we're doing this. A just regard for the opinions of mankind. Okay? 18th century language, here's why. We want you all to understand. Okay? A just regard for the opinion of mankind. And Jefferson doesn't put any new ideas into the Declaration. It's all Protestant Christianity, and it's all Enlightenment thought. Okay? But it's distilled into this document. Jefferson wrote, "We hold these truths to be self-evident." So the truths I'm going to write are obvious. That all men are created equal. That all men are created equal. That phrase, ladies and gentlemen, that's the phrase that's going to resonate to this day. Because he doesn't say all white men. He says all men. Now, do the vast majority of Americans at this time think that it means all white men? Yes, they do. Okay? But the word white was deliberately left out. They thought about it. This is going to leave open the door for progress, you see. That they, all these men, are endowed, given by their Creator, God, with certain unalienable rights, rights that cannot be taken away. Unalienable. That among these are life, right to life, liberty, freedom, and the pursuit of happiness. Don't leave off the word pursuit. It doesn't say you have a right to what? Happiness. You don't. No one could do that for you. You have the right to pursue it. Define it how you will. You can pursue it. Now let's hold that thought right there. Today we are engaged in a great political debate about what rights we should have in addition to life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. Some people are saying you have a right to a home. Others are saying you have a right to a college education. In other words, you don't have to pay for it. Others are saying you have a right to health care. You don't have to pay for it. Okay? The Founding Fathers would not go that far because they knew that a right was something that you had out of nature, right? It was a natural right, John Locke. Now, these may be good ideas. I'm not going to tell you one way or another. That's for you to decide. You vote the way you will. But you have to understand the difference between a right to a college education and the right to life, as Locke defined it. That's a natural right. A right to a college education means that you're going to get something that somebody else has to work for to give you. And now you get it free. How are you going to pay them? Otherwise, you're denying their right, aren't you? You see? So any right that we talk about today that requires somebody else's work, you've got to figure out how to pay for that. It's not the same kind of right as the Founding Fathers meant by life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. Okay? Again, I'm not saying you can't redefine these things. But you have to understand what you're doing. Yes?
I was going to say, I think it'd be helpful for those who don't know to define and distinguish between the positive and negative right.
Okay. Yeah, good. Positive rights and negative rights. Good. Founding Fathers and historians of this era will talk about positive rights and negative rights. Founding Fathers are concerned about negative rights relative to the federal government. The federal government cannot do this, hence the Bill of Rights. Modern people are concerned about positive rights. The federal government will do this for me. You see? Free college. Positive and negative. All right, back to our declaration. But basically, that's what the 2020 election is going to be about, folks. One political party is going to say, more rights, and the other political party is going to say, no, we don't believe in that. You should not vote until you know the difference and know why you think what you think. Be an informed voter. So we haven't had an election as important as the one in 2020 since 1860, the eve of the Civil War. That to secure these rights, life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. Governments are instituted amongst men. The purpose of a government is to give you these rights, to guarantee these rights. And the government derives their just powers from the consent of the governed. Where does government get its power? From you. The consent of the governed. The Constitution of the United States, written a dozen years later, roughly, says, we the people. That's the first phrase. Okay? We the people in order to form a more perfect union. See? That's the government. That's where the power originates. That is not the way governments were in the 18th century. Where does power originate in the 18th century? With the king. And every one of those kings would say he got his power from whom? God. Thank you. This could not be more radical, more different. And you can see why kings hated this. Scared to death. That whenever any form of government becomes destructive of these ends, life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. If a government is destroying those things, what? It is the right of the people to alter or abolish that government. That's a right of revolution. They're taking away those basic rights. You have a right to rebel. Well, what is this document? Declaration of Independence. A declaration of war against Great Britain because it's destroying these rights. Life, liberty, pursuit of happiness. Let's put it another way. What is Jefferson, under the influence of the Enlightenment and Protestant Christianity, saying here about the relationship between government and man? Government is a relationship between itself and man. Jefferson is simply stating that government was made to serve the former, man. Government is made to serve man, rather than the other way around. Man is not made to serve the government. That would be King George's interpretation. You serve me as my subject. You do what I say. This is reminiscent of what Jesus said about the Sabbath, isn't it? Man was not made for the Sabbath, to be ruled over by that one day of the week. The Sabbath was made for man to rest that day. See? The Pharisees had gotten it wrong in the passage of time. The kings had gotten it wrong in the passage of time. Jesus was a revolutionary. Thomas Jefferson, though not Jesus, was also a revolutionary. Now, how would King George have responded to Jefferson's argument? Surely he read it at some point a few weeks later when it crossed the ocean. He would have perhaps referred to the divinely ordained nature of monarchy. God made me king. God did not want me to be king. I would not be king. He is omniscient. He is omnipotent. He is all-powerful. I'm clearly king by God's will. And it's the duty of Englishmen to obey their sovereign, their king, who loves them. Why are these colonists causing me so much trouble? And then he would have laughed at the notion that the purpose of government was to provide a pursuit of happiness. No, the purpose of government, folks, is to secure the people, to make them safe from foreign invasion and from each other, laws and so forth, to raise the taxes and to keep order, to execute justice. That's the purpose of government. Pursuit of happiness. What is happiness anyway? That's King George's response. But as we've seen, King George's government had engaged in acts in these dozen years which seemed to hack away at traditional American liberties. Things were changing since the end of the 7 Years' War, and as far as the colonists were concerned, not for the better. Freedoms we had before the war were gone. Rights we had before the war evaporated. And now we have these British soldiers on our streets, living in our homes. And these liberties that we had brought undreamt of prosperity to the colonists, to the point that the British soldiers who visited these colonies, and their officers as well, they wrote letters home saying how rich these colonists were. They couldn't believe it. Average American colonists, little farmers, they lived so well. They ate so well. They owned their own farms. They owned their own businesses. They voted on their own taxes and so forth, at least till very recently, right? Undreamt of prosperity relative to the rest of the world. You see, the very idea that the average person, a common person as they were called, 90% of the people, could gain wealth through the labor of his own hands was new. Before the colonial experience in America, work was something that the poor had to do just to stay alive. And they got to keep enough of whatever they worked for to feed themselves and clothe themselves and put a roof over their heads maybe, but that was it. If the crop was better that year, the Lord just got more. And if the crop was not good enough, in fact, perhaps there was even a famine, because the Lord was going to take his share. There was almost no sense that you could work your way out of poverty with your own hands. Wasn't that kind of freedom, folks? Except in America. But in America, work was accomplishing that previously unimaginable goal. Prosperity was happening. And since it was happening, the thought that the British government could just pass whatever taxes they want and take that prosperity away, and you couldn't do nothing about it, that was terrifying. They're not treating us as if we're even human. Certainly not like we're equals. And this is white people. Okay? White people. The American Revolution and this part of American history is about equality for white men. If we forget that and we focus on what it didn't do, it didn't give women equality, it didn't free blacks, it didn't treat the Native Americans particularly well, and that's all we know, we would not value it. But that's not this century. Those are future fights. And those are future fights placed in motion, in play, because of the Declaration of Independence, because that word white was left out. All men are created equal. But more than economic well-being was at stake. I've made an economic argument here. Colonists didn't want to lose what prosperity they had. That's only part of it. There's a philosophical argument. There's also the religious argument, too, that we've mentioned. Americans, under the influence of Protestant Christianity and the Enlightenment, had come to believe that man was completely different than kings and princes and priests said he was. Kings and princes and priests said, man, you white men are inferior to us. We're up here and you are down there. And you should be happy for the crumbs we let fall from our tables. You ungrateful scum. That is the 18th century. But the Americans are saying, no. I'm not scum. And I won't take it anymore. Jefferson had said all men were created equal. And because all men were created equal, society had to be transformed. Monarchy, which was based on hierarchy and inequality, has to be abolished. And republican, that is, democratic institutions have to be created. Enlightened republican relationships have to be built amongst the people. Indeed, the people must be given a voice in their government. We the people. What does equality mean for the Founding Fathers? This again is completely at play in 2020. Okay? Very important to know what equality meant for the Founding Fathers. It means political and judicial equality. It meant that every man who qualified could have one vote. There's an age qualification, and at this time in most colonies and states, there's a property qualification. Not high, but there was a qualification. And then judicial equality, that meant that a man was entitled, if he's accused of a crime, he's entitled to a trial, and the jury is to be composed of what kind of people? Peers, meaning people like him. Political and judicial equality, that's what the Founding Fathers were striving for. Wanted to create. They want every white man to be treated the same. Okay? Is that ever going to happen? No. Because human beings are imperfect. Okay? It's not possible to be perfect. But that's the goal. Today we are engaged in a great debate. What does equality mean? Does it mean social equality? Does it mean economic equality, that everybody has the same amount of money? There are many in America today and in the world today who would like to see economic equality. That the government would distribute money so that everybody has the same. Okay? Or distribute it so much more so that there's not very much difference between rich and poor. So you have to decide, what does equality mean for you? You have to know the pros and cons of each side. Some things sound great until you actually work out how that's going to be put in place and what's that going to require. So, but for the Founding Fathers, it's political and judicial equality. And that's it. But it's crucial to remember that in the 18th century, white men were not equal with one another. Europe was run by monarchs and the aristocracy who saw all other men as inferior. But Dr. Benjamin Rush and many other Americans saw that their revolution, the American Revolution, might well go on, even after the Revolutionary War ended. So here's a difficult concept. The Revolutionary War might end, but the American Revolution in concept might go on. And those who were arguing that we should redefine equality might look back to the American Revolution, if they were so inclined, and say the revolution goes on, we have to finish what the Founding Fathers started. Okay. Now, they're not generally inclined to think that way, but they might. So that's what Benjamin Rush is getting at. He said, there is nothing more common than to confound, that is, confuse, the terms, the beginning and the ending, of the American Revolution with those of the late American Revolutionary War. The war had its beginning and its end. The American Revolution, for Rush, goes on to this day as we continually redefine what it means to be equal and free. And that is the basis of this class, which I told you in the syllabus that the way to understand American history is to see it as a process of becoming or failure to become of two ideas. What? Equal and free, exactly. A change over time. And that's exactly what Benjamin Rush is saying. The American Revolution set in process the possibility of this change over time, from then until this day. And with anything human, it's possible to change for the good, and it's possible to change for the evil. That responsibility is on your shoulders. In summary, Americans were moved to revolution because even the poorest among them had experienced a better life in the colonies than people had in Europe. And because they had come to believe in an entirely different definition of what man was and what his relationship to government ought to be. Since the French and Indian War had ended, Great Britain had clearly been threatening these beliefs. Questions? Okay, so what are important causes of the American Revolution? Or important people, events? Somebody a little bit louder? Okay, the statement was the coercive acts are important to understand that. Okay, I would agree. Who is Paul Revere? Yeah. Okay, who is Paul Revere? Good question. Huh? Who else? What else? Yes? What are the main causes of the American Revolution? That is a grand question that asks you to understand the various causes, such as Enlightenment thought, Protestant Christianity, and then the irritation over what? Over the taxes, right? And Americans were irritated just because they didn't like paying taxes, right? No. What's the difference? They don't have representation. That's the key point. Don't let some cagey professor mix you up on that. What else can we say is important? Self-government. Yeah, self-government, okay. Republican idea of democracy. Yes, the prosperity of the colonies relative to the rest of the world is a huge issue. Great Britain sees that prosperity and wants to tax it. Okay? All right, God bless you all. I'll see you next time.